Thank you, Paul, and welcome to this, the first conference of the ICCE. This is a global event, and I must congratulate the organizers, Paul, Gauris, Dr. Frenny, and all the board members for putting together such a wonderful event over 2 days. Thank you all. And we also welcome our first speakers following this inaugural is Mr. Pierre Jacquet, who is the president of the Global Development Network, who will be speaking on people-led growth. It's a wonderful to have him here, and all the speakers over the next 2 days. Welcome you all to this event. In fact, our sincere appreciation to Paul for the promoter of ICCE. He has done extremely hard work and supported by the entire team members to put together this event. You know, the core objective of this organizations, the newly formed organizations, we are still at the startup level, almost a year in existence, little more than a year, and we have about 30 learners who are globally over continents, who have taken up the accreditation certification. And we aim to promote this certification as a global accreditation agency, which would provide, real, career opportunities for many aspiring economists. We also endeavor to have capacity building and training activities, undertake consulting, engage in policy advocacy in several contemporary topics. So we actually aim very high, and I think GEIF, the Global Ideas Festival, which is being launched, is devoted towards that end. Since the first topic is people-led growth, and let me just highlight some of the issues very briefly from my perspectives, and I'm sure we're going to hear a lot from Mr. Jacquet. And the first, I see a lot of things, which is affecting globally the people and the work and the life in the society. And the first thing I could say that there is a fast forward towards digitalization post-pandemic. The decisions today are so much dominated by data-driven, using artificial intelligence, machine learning, and all of these techniques are becoming extremely important. The data is becoming the new oil in the global economy. And all of these trends are spearheaded by the advances in technology, blockchain, and the emerging metaverse, which I'm sure once it unfolds, it would shape up the entire communication in the global economy, affecting all sectors. The COVID pandemic induced actually the trend towards digital accelerations, and these are increasingly felt how is going to replacing the human interface in the industry. So the questions that we ask today is that how will this impact the future of work and life? Our life and in the society are so much dominated by technology, social media, all of this together. In fact, going forward, even we can contemplate this technology might even change dominate the geopolitical discourse. Even countries' competitiveness and the country's resource endowments, which are now supplemented by technology, I'm sure that would create enormous, disruption in the way you think, the way you work, and the way you communicate. This is one I thought I must emphasize, and I'm sure over these 2 days you would have a lot of inputs on this technological front. I think the second point I see is this digital acceleration also is creating some kind of a skill bias. What I mean is the high skill labor today are all in greater demand, and to a large extent, the middle skill jobs are beginning to vanish. And this is where I think emerging economies, developing economies, economies in Africa, I think this is where I think we need to be more concerned when a large section of our populations which have the low skill level, and that is actually beginning to vanish. This skill bias is definitely going to cause a large scale shift in the structure of the demand for labor and employment, and globally everywhere. We are now encountering what is called a platform economy, and the power of platform economy is here to stay. And what I mean is the platform is everything is through the computers, everything is through the communications involving internet and computer. That dominates our economic system today. We are also witnessing the mass layoff, by these technology companies, whether it is Twitter, Meta, Amazon, Shopify, all of this. I think that the tech industry is in an uproar. Very, very uncaring approach. I'm sure you witnessed the last weeks how the Elon Musk, the Twitter CEO, could retrench a large part of the manpower all of a sudden, unconditionally. So I'm sure these layoffs are going to prop up in a significant extent, and that's not what the labor force was used to. And I'm sure that is becoming a new normal that's going to affect our global employment as situation as well. That's the other. I think the other point which I thought briefly mention is a bit of talent migration is also happening in the job market. Almost, there are studies which says in America, 40 million workers have quit their jobs during the last 2 years. And the people want to switch their companies for whatever reasons, travel, work from home, conditions for work, or even they want to have leisure, health and safety for whatever reasons. There's a large section of people that are beginning to quit their jobs. People want to do something otherwise, which the evidence shows that people are attempting to do something which they have little or no experience. They want to have their own startups, experiment something new. So there is some shift in the way the talent is now reshaping globally. There's a migration which is happening. What I can see is that the risk-taking behavior is taking the center stage of global workshops. People are willing to take risk, experiment new things, innovate startups in the new domain. And this is something is happening. And so these are trends that one is seeing, and at the same time, we also see there are signs of disillusionment, among employees. And even in today, the most seemingly professional organizations, you would find the employees have a lot of stress, a lot of disillusionment. And so I think we need to have move towards a better and caring world, caring for them, the people, labor force, women in particular, and all of this are very critical areas where I think the conference will spend energy to ideate some of the areas like that. And the other point that I thought I just mentioned in a very briefly is that the labor mobility. I think I remember in our economist, Professor Jagadish Bhagwati predicted that it is the global labor mobility that was the engine of growth in 21st century. The trade in goods and services actually were in the 19th century, and the capital movement which dominated the 20th century. So therefore, what we see is that the technology is now transforming, again back to technology, transforming both migration and work. What you increasingly see is that people are migrating without migration, without migrating. What I mean is that quote unquote migration without migrating. is an outcome of offshoring, outsourcing, online programming. You sit in somewhere in the corner of India or China and work for the corporations around the globe through internet and using of the same platform economy. So the business over platform is going to dominate. The people can work anywhere in the world, use of technology sitting in some of the corners of the emerging economy, Africa or India and China. So I believe these are extremely important and would impact the future of our work. We need to understand the trend without much elaborations. And I think we have many more topics related to macroeconomy, climate change, the fear of global inflation and recession today, the tensions in trade with the US and China, ESG, all of these are extremely important topic. And I congratulate the team for putting together all of them for this in the event. So thank you very much. I look forward to the event. This will give us an opportunity to learn from every one of us participating. Thank you, Paul. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Pradhan. That was a very impressive overview of what the GEIF seeks to achieve. Most importantly, about the main theme, which is going to be our topic for discussion in the next session, which literally is going to be touching on most of the areas, most of the things that matter to us as we try to recover from all the shocks that the global economy has gone through. So I'll use the next 2 minutes to just briefly share a bit of information about the ICCE. So the ICCE is the Institute of Certified Chartered Economists. So the organization is a certification body committed to raising economists globally through education and collaborative learning. And so through education, we offer a certification program called the Chartered Economist Designation. So if you are an individual that is currently working as an economist, if you are aspiring to pursue a career as an economist, if your current role or your future role requires that you have some knowledge in economics, then of course the ICCE is the required and of course recommended certification for you. And through the education, of course, we have various, we have a curriculum that covers various known and of course new areas of economics. So you are required to go through some series of examination leading to your certification as a chartered economist. And of course, we work just like other professional organizations that are known in other disciplines, for example, in accounting, in finance, of course, in marketing. There are known brands in that field. So in the field of economics, we are the leading certification for economists or anyone aspiring to pursue a career as an economist, or your current role or your future role requires that you have some knowledge in economics. So you go through that curriculum, of course, leading to your award as a chartered economist from the ICCE. And for collaborative learning, of course, GEIF is a testament to that. We are committed to creating very relevant platforms that will engineer conversations that are very important to the global economy. And our conversation for collaborative learning covers, various angles. So some are country specific, some are regional focused, and of course, some are global, like the GEIF that we are having. So when you're part of the ICCE, you get a chance to participate in most of these sessions. And of course, currently when you go to our YouTube channel platform, you find some of this relevant content there that you can even watch later on. So you'll get a chance to engage. Currently, most of our platform has been virtual because of the current situation we find ourselves. But of course, we know that is going to change. So we'll give our learners and our members and our partners opportunity to meet in person, to interact, and of course, engage, which adds more value than the typical online platform that we have created. So GEIF, as we've seen today, being the first session, of course, a virtual edition. Hopefully next year, we're going to have an in-person or physical GEIF. We'll communicate where it's going to be held. This year, it originally planned to be held in Mumbai, India, and then we shifted to virtual. Next year, we'll do in-person, and of course, it will likely move to a city, whether it's going to be Mumbai or otherwise. Of course, the management will decide, and then we'll let you know. But for today, we're going to sit back. We're going to enjoy the sessions that we have. covering various topics, interesting topics, and of course, through series of conversations and coordination, we arrive at these topics. We believe that at this point in time, these are relevant conversations that need to be had. So for us, we're very excited that we're going to be sharing the next 2 days with you from wherever you're joining us from. This is a global platform. We have people joining us from all over the world, as can be seen even from our speaker lineup. So we're very excited for this opportunity. And of course, we look forward to engaging all of you. There will be set time for questions and all of that so you can engage our speakers. Without much ado, I think I'll be wrapping up so we can kickstart our conversation for our first keynote starter. We are very fortunate for us to have both the speaker and of course the moderator for the session here with us. And so without much ado, I will hand over to our moderator who will take over the next session. At least for the next 1 hour, we're going to have a very interesting conversation which borders around the theme for this year's Global Economic Ideas Festival. So Danelee, if you're there and you can hear me, please, the time is now for you to take over and begin your conversation. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Pierre. Nice to meet
Hello.
you. Hi, Prof.
Yes, Danelee, we can hear you. You may proceed. Okay.
Sorry, I just missed out the start. I'm having problems with my headset. Can you just be with me for a second?
Yeah.
I need to. Is it time to kick off?
Yes, please. You have the floor, please.
Sorry. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can hear you. Can you hear me? Can you hear us?
And can I be heard as well? Does it
Okay,
work?
here we go. I
Okay.
seem to have had an interruption. I'm very sorry for that. So,
That's fine.
all right. So, we are live. I would like to welcome everyone to the first session, the first keynote session that we have today. I would have the pleasure of introducing our first keynote speaker, Pierre Jacquet, who's the president of the Global Development Network. Pierre is also the fourth president of the Global Development Network. He lives and works in France. Formerly chief economist of the French Development Agency between 2012 and 2012. He also served as the executive director in charge of strategy from 2002 to 2010. Preceding AFD, he was the deputy director of the French Institute of International Relations, where he was responsible for the economic program and was the chief editor of the IFRA's quarterly review Politique Internationale. From 1994 to 2012, Pierre Jacquet was the president of the Department of Economic and Social Sciences and professor of the International Economics, a French graduate engineering school. He also lectured in various business schools and universities such as INSEAD, Sciences Po and Paris School of Economics, and École Nationale d'Administration. Excuse my French, it's not very refined. We welcome you with us today, and we very much look forward to the engagement that we are going to have with you today. So welcome, Pierre. Please do start with your presentation.
Thank you very much, Danelee. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are. And I would like to thank the organizers for this opportunity to engage in this discussion with all of you. I have a PowerPoint to share, so let me see whether I can manage that. In principle, I should be able to do that. Yeah. Okay. Does it work? Can you see my screen?
We can. Thank you, Pierre. We can see.
Okay, very good. So my subject, as it was suggested to me by the organizers, and I've not changed actually a word of it, is engineering people-led growth, creating a safe, secure, and equitable world. I do that, of course, from my perspective of the Global Development Network. And Global Development Network is an international organization headquartered in New Delhi, whose mission is to strengthen research capacity in developing countries. And you will not be surprised that in my presentation, I will come back to the role of research in development. And I would like also to mention in the start that these are ideas for debate. I'm not going to give any solutions to reach or to engineer people-led growth. I mean, I think we need to join forces and examine the various aspects of the subject to be able to see the way forward, if you wish. And one of my points is that we need more debate, more ideas sharing, more equitable sharing of ideas, and more research. So I will do that in two main stages. First, since there is growth in the title, I want to spend some time discussing about growth, and it's part of the ongoing debate right now between the supporters of more growth and the degrowth people. So I'd like to say a few words about that. Then my second point will be on the concentration of research on development and ideas, which I think is counterproductive. And I will then briefly conclude. So let me start with growth and mention that it's historically, it's quite a recent phenomenon. And you can see on this graph, which actually is due to the data assembled by Madison at the OECD some time ago. He reconstituted the series of real GDP per head since year one. And that graph shows that growth took off in the middle of the 19th century and accelerated in the 20th century. But before that, we had a relatively flat profile. So it's a recent phenomenon. And of course, the question that comes immediately is whether it is a parenthesis of history or a new regime. And we don't know what will happen next. But for many centuries, humanity lived without growth. Now, we could then discuss whether growth brought an increase in the standards of living, which is probably, of course, the case. But the fact is that for many centuries, we had no growth. And when we discuss growth nowadays, we take it as a given reality, and we have the feeling that without it, we are not in a normal situation. So that's interesting. I'm personally in favor of growth, with a caveat that I will mention later. But having a historical view is, I think, quite interesting, because it lets us to think about what exactly we call growth, what do we mean by growing, and what kind of growth do we need. And I think the debate between growth and degrowth is too simple to that extent, because it doesn't question what growth is about. And this is one of the points that I want to emphasize. One of the point of departures to look at growth is the 2010 growth report by the Commission on Growth and Development, chaired by Michael Spence. It's an interesting report because I think when it set out to work, it probably wanted to identify some common criteria for growth. And what it came to in the conclusion is that it's quite difficult to do, because the experiences that they surveyed, and what they did is to look at 13 economies having shown growth rate higher than 7% a year for more than 25 consecutive years since 1950. Which is already quite extraordinary that it happened, right? But when they looked at these 13 economies, they found that the experiences were quite specific to the countries. And the only common features that they could identify were leadership and effective government and public investment in infrastructure, education, and health. And of course, it's something that is quite interesting because it shows that when we reflect on policies for growth, we don't have much to say that is actually anchored on empirical studies. It's still very much a question of judgment about how to engineer this unusual chemistry through which everything grows together. And that's something that is quite difficult to engineer from scratch, obviously. They also identify market forces and competition, but with an idea that I think is vital, which is to the role of the government to protect people and not to protect activities or to protect production. And an important question that is asked in the report and that is also present in today's debate is whether there are limits to growth. And of course, the current debate is focused on climate and biodiversity and the physical quantity of natural resources available. And it may seem that there are limits to growth. However, the report doesn't take position, and I think it's a right position not to take position on that, because what matters from an economic perspective is not the actual quantity of resources in the soil, it's how these resources are used, and it's basically the demand for these resources as a ratio to the available supply. And it may be the case that that ratio remains constant while the quantity of natural resources diminishes because technology allows us to substitute for the use of natural resources, at least up to some extent. So it's not that I am a technology optimist. I don't think that technology solves all problems, but I think that discounting technological change would be a mistake. We can't predict the future, but certainly technology will be part of that future. So the time is not to, I think, to be agnostic on this question of whether there are limits to growth, for me, is the place to be. Another aspect which we need always to keep in mind is that growth is a means to an end. It's not an end per se. It is necessary to achieve other important objectives, which are basically increase of the standard of living. And the problem with the current way growth is measured, which is the annual growth of real gross domestic product, is grossly inadequate. That metric is grossly inadequate for many reasons that we know. Part of production and part of consumption behaviors damages the environment, damages biodiversity, creates pollution, and so on, which in itself runs counter to the idea of improving living standards and would make any progress unsustainable. And we also know that GDP growth doesn't address at all issues of income distribution. So we can have growth with increase in inequalities, and this is not an increase in the standard of living. I mean, we can, on average, say standards of living have increased, but the average is not what matters. We need to have a people-centric view and to look at distribution. And growth per se doesn't bring the answer to that. And the difficulty is that this question of standard of living is multifarious. It involves many different criteria, and it's hard to measure. So we go back to the only measure that exists, which is growth of GDP, and it then becomes an objective in itself. So talking about growth is still very much in the news everywhere in the world, even though we know that it is not what we ultimately should care about. And this is certainly one of the problems in engineering the transition toward green growth or green economy, or toward or the energy transition or the climate transition. All these transitions require rethinking what growth is about, but at the same time, we commit to the transition and we talk about real GDP growth. And that is somehow inconsistent. And behind that question, there is a fundamental valuation problem. When we talk about the standard of living, we intuitively include a number of things that are not valued neither through markets nor through policies. And this, of course, does become quite a problem, because without knowing the value of these things we value, we will find difficulties in integrating them in our thinking and in policy formulation. So the ultimate point I want to make here is that we need growth, but not the kind of growth that is currently measured. We need growth in the standards of living. And defining what it means, it's something that is that requires to give a fair value to things that current markets and policies don't value enough. And as I said, that includes the quality of air and pollution, biodiversity, inequalities, social interactions, all that matters, and the quality of the nature around us, all that matters very much for the standard of living, but it's not valued right now in GDP. And one of the major difficulties is that this process of value creation, which is a collective process, involves all countries, but cannot take place in the same way and at the same place everywhere, because we have different culture and histories, because our priorities depend on our current income and standard of living, and because the way in which we value these various things depend on the place we are in. So that's a big issue of international cooperation. And one of the difficulties, of course, is to create a shared international agenda that is not dictated by which countries' perceived priorities, and how to define a principle of mutual recognition. Mutual recognition in the European sense of the terms means a common basis on which to agree for the whole world, and then an acceptation of differences of views across countries for the rest. And that's something which I think in this process of finding new values for what matters for us, I think this is something that's going to be needed, because we're not going to value exactly the same things in the same ways across the whole world. That leads me to arguing that we are right now in a major transition period. And I refer in this slide to something which I call high politics, which is what determines the framework for managing international relations. And within that framework, the management of these relations belongs to law politics. That is, how much trade protection, what are the measures that would be taken for the movement of goods, services, people, culture, and so on. These are to be considered within a global framework in which we agree on some basic values. And this is what high politics is about. This is what happened after World War II. But the framework that was created after World War II has now become obsolete. We all know that. It needs complete redefinition. The adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals can be considered as a step forward, but it's of course hugely insufficient. And one of the major difficulties is that the current global environment is not conducive at all to this high politics discussion, which implies an international cooperation on deep issues about the values that count, that can be shared, and this mutual recognition principle. And the big question is whether a new global framework dealing with current issues can be put in place or not in the absence of a major crisis. And I must say, I'm not particularly optimistic in that area. I hope we can manage it. It seems to me that it will probably happen, hopefully, without a major crisis, hopefully, but that will be through muddling through. And of course, muddling through is not an optimal situation. That's one of the difficulties that we have. Now, in this discussion, all points of views across the world will matter. So an important challenge there, and what would at least keep me optimistic is whether we will be able to meet that challenge, is to increase the voice of developing countries so that the debate is inclusive. So we don't start by looking at the current world and say, oh, what was done in the past is wonderful, let's keep on doing the same thing. But we hear different perspectives about what counts, what matters. And this is something that we have not been able to do enough. And this is what I want to comment on right now. The fact is that research on social sciences, which is what we are talking about, is overly concentrated in high-income countries. And I can show a graph right now. It's a bit, well, it's not complicated, but it's a graph that shows a number of citable documents per million inhabitants. So it's the ratio on the population of various places over 1996, 2021. So it's a long period, a quarter of a century. And it's analyzed through income categories: high income, low income, lower middle income, upper middle income. And on the vertical, on the y-axis, you have the number of citable documents per million inhabitants. And the color indicates the region. So what comes really immediately out of this picture is the concentration of citable documents published in social sciences across the world in high-income countries. The dismal position of sub-Saharan Africa and low-income countries generally, certainly of Latin America as well. And that's something that, of course, shows that concentration. Now, my point is that concentration is a problem. We could argue that it increases the effectiveness of research, because when research is concentrated in one place, in a big university, then there are economies of scales, it can be more effective, production can increase, and so on. This is true. But at the same time, there are very important biases in the choice of themes that are studied, in the methods that are promoted and used, and in the ways knowledge is used to inform policies. And for me, these biases run counter the objective of inclusion. These biases are often ignored, and finding new paths for inclusive growth requires more inclusive debates, more inclusive research, a research that is not dominated by one view of the world, which is the view that is studied for legitimate reasons in developed countries. So it seems to me that a priority of development assistance should be to promote more research capacity and research work in developing countries, and not only development research and analytical work conducted by researchers based in high-income countries. Let me go back to this question of knowledge use, because it is true that knowledge on global challenges and knowledge on development is a global public good. Once it's produced somewhere, it can circulate everywhere at a zero marginal cost, provided that access is free to that published research, which is not always the case, but it is a global public good. But the production of knowledge is a global public good, but the use of it is not a global public good, it's a local good. Using knowledge to inform policies and shape solutions is local, it is political, it is social. It implies interpretation. The same piece of research can be interpreted differently in different places and lead to very different policy prescriptions. It requires the implication of non-researchers, decision makers, civil society at all stages of research, including the formulation of research questions. Because if research questions are formulated without any reference to what is of interest for decision makers, then knowledge will not be used. And of course, it includes using knowledge includes the issues of implementation. That is, how to implement policies, not only what policies should be adopted. And you will notice that in many seminars, in many talks, we tend to focus on what should be done. But of course, it is very insufficient. We need to understand how things could be done as well. And if we don't discuss the how, just focusing on the what is not going to bring any implementable solution. So my point is that locally conducted research is key to the kind of intermediation process that is needed to link scientific knowledge wherever produced and knowledge use leading to policy formulation. So this role of research not as a production mechanism of papers that will be published, which of course is important, but as a process through which one can use existing evidence and existing knowledge to put as an input in a debate that leads to policy formulation is something that is, I think, vital, and it is key to inclusiveness. We cannot think of an inclusive policy without involving all points of view as much as we can. It will never be possible and feasible. But right now, this concentration of ideas in the debate is something that is quite damageable. Without local research capacity, the production and use of knowledge cannot be inclusive. So let me conclude, and I was told to speak between 20 and 25 minutes, so I think I'm trying to respect that time span so that we can have a discussion. We need to move from research for development, which is something that is very utilitarian. It is focused on the production of research, and then it disseminates through communication to policymakers who apply researchers' recommendation. This is research for development. And our view at GDN is research as development. It's a process, it's a mechanism that allows us to critically look at evidence, to inspire debates, to raise issues that have local relevance and bearing. And research is also a way to constantly check actions and policies against initial objectives, unforeseen implications. So research and action should be much more integrated as they are today. And there are now evaluation techniques that allow to do that, to have a much more closer academic look at actions while things are implemented, and to learn from implementation so that action can be improved and there is a better chance to make it more effective. This is obviously a long-term process. Unfortunately, the needs to reshape world governance is urgent, so there are no easy solutions. And that's why I think that we will probably muddle through in this current situation, and whether we will be able to avoid a major crisis, either due to climate change or to geopolitical unrest and so on, is something that is quite open. So it is quite likely that in the end we will have a new international order, but it will come out much more through muddling through than through a rational, well thought out aggiornamento, because we don't have, the conditions are not ready right now for such an aggiornamento. So I leave you with that, and we'll be happy to enter any discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Pierre, for a very interesting presentation that you have put together, and also opening up our minds a little bit towards the discussions around growth. I think often we find ourselves in an environment where crisis can shape the policy responses that governments respond to. At least we've seen some of that in the pandemic. So I want to perhaps open up with a question here before we go to the audience to get the debate going. But I want to get a sense from you, where should we be optimistic or pessimistic, if you want to choose that line of direction, around maybe the structural trends that have emerged since the pandemic? So, I mean, with regard to moving towards a new measurement for growth potentially, we've got so many various facets. I'm going to throw a couple of ideas in and then see what stick on your side. But things like digitalization, you've mentioned climate change. We've got governments that need to rebuild fiscal space, yet the developmental agendas have never been bigger. So I want to get your sense around, you know, where do you see, or where are you more optimistic or pessimistic with regard to your topic in this post-pandemic world?
Thanks. Well, this is, of course, a tough question. Let me mention two major points. One is that we are able to learn from crisis. at least in the short term, and that's an important point. There are two caveats to that. One is that we learn in the short term. So indeed, we were able to react to the major COVID crisis in ways that are often criticized, but frankly, the record is quite encouraging. We were able to face up to that major crisis, even though we were not prepared for that. So that's something that is quite important. My fear is that what we learned was a short-term learning process, and we tend to forget what we learned. So we tend to want to go back to the world before. It's unclear to me what lasting effects of the COVID crisis will be on the improvement of our health structure, our degree of preparation, our capacity to face up to uncertainty. I'm fascinated by the fact that increasingly populations in many countries want to live in a much more certain world, and they turn to the government to provide certainty. And this simply is not feasible. The world is uncertain, period. We will always have uncertainty ahead of us. So we should learn uncertainty. We should learn how to face up to uncertainty. So but still there was some learning. Now, of course, the first caveat is whether we can learn in the long term, which is a bit unclear. Some things probably, but not enough. And the second difficulty, I think, is that we needed a crisis for that. So what tempers my optimism is that without the crisis, we don't have enough incentive to prepare for the next crisis. And you can see that with climate change. Climate change is now discussed everywhere. We know enough about climate change. We know that it's something that is very dangerous for humanity, and that we can actually manage it partially. We can mitigate further climate deterioration, and we can work on adaptation. Everyone knows we can do that, but action is still lagging very much behind, because the incentive of knowing is not enough. What will be enough is the difficulty to live through the crisis, and then we act. So this characteristic of humanity is not particularly encouraging, because we would lack, of course, much more efforts at prevention than a capacity to manage. I hope we can join forces, and as the evidence again continues to come on the table, that we will finally be able to bring our acts together. The second reason of optimism is that the current difficulties of the world seem to point to, quote unquote, deglobalization. But at the same time, we have a number of signs that globalization, at least in practice, is actually working very well. You have digitalization. Right now, I'm talking to you from a place in the center of France, and I don't know where you are, probably not in the same place, all of you, but this is crossing oceans, right? Well, this is extraordinary, and it's really a source of long-term optimism. Similarly, when you look at the COVID crisis, you mentioned it, it was addressed through international cooperation, obviously. Of course, it was also created somehow by globalization, but the solution was not a country-based solution. It was basically international, full of tensions, as always, but it happened. So that is something that makes me confident that whatever happens, we cannot run, politics can run against globalization, but up to some point. It is still there as a major force of the world economy. And one of the difficulties, of course, will be to make the political dimensions coincide somehow with the economic dimension. And this is also one of the challenges. So a lot of mistakes can be made, but the long-term trends, I think, go in the sense that I'm personally convinced it should go to, which is humanism in the end, and human beings across the world as a human community. Unfortunately, we are not there yet, but I think there are long-term trends that that are there, and I would put them in the good column. And of course, in the bad column, we have the fact that the world is politically divided and that everyone thinks in their narrow space, which I can understand as well.
Absolutely, Pierre, thank you. I couldn't agree with you more on that point. I was struck by the conclusion that you made that, you know, we haven't quite on a global scale even started to think about addressing how to achieve the growth that is necessary to hone in on what you say, a more people-orientated growth focus. And then you also mentioned that we need more local research capacity, the production of knowledge that is necessary to come from more developing countries. There's a question from the floor that, you know, links into this, specifically about what the role private business leaders within sub-Saharan Africa can play in leading the change that we need, especially where political leadership is not rising to that responsibility. I think that is a very relevant point because it ties into what you've mentioned around the political divide often being a distraction and not helping for, you know, the local voices to come through to the debate. So what is your opinion on that? That would be quite a good discussion point. One could have a whole day on this, really.
I think that private business leaders are in a very special position to take actions that promote change, and therefore they have a big role to play. And they can play it, I think, in two ways. One is their own personal commitment. And I'm sure that there are some business leaders that are genuinely committed to protecting biodiversity, to finding ways to promote green and inclusive growth that includes in their own mind social and environmental objectives as much as quote unquote economic and profit-based objective. There are some who do that. But for others, they may be personally convinced about it. Not all of them, but many of them, I think. But they have to face the realities of world competition. And we need governments to come in there to set some rules of the game. And the current rules of the game are not conducive to a transition toward a greener, more inclusive economy. And if I take the environmental case, regulations are not strong enough on CO2 emissions. I'm personally in favor of a carbon tax, for example. It's not there enough in many places. So that's examples of where regulation would be needed. But even if you look at the social dimensions, I think the basic problem of sharing value between capital and labor is still very much open. The way in which it is done right now is not satisfactory. And we could see that during the COVID situation. In the COVID, we finally discovered that many professions that are not paid very much had a very, very important social role. So the logical conclusion is that in these professions, the salaries are not comparable to the social value of the jobs. So these are things on which the market is not functioning well. And I'm very much, as an economist, in favor of markets. I think markets are the only coordination mechanism that has so much power. But I think that if we want to reach societal objectives, including social and environmental objectives, markets need to be regulated. And the current regulation is important. So I agree that private business leaders, to come back for your questions, play a major role in the transition that is necessary, but they cannot do that alone. They need to have the proper set of business incentives as well. And even if some of them are personally convinced, that will not be enough because they have companies to manage. They have a reality to abide to. So regulation matters. So it's a combination of private and public action that can do the trick, not only one of them only.
Thank you, Pierre. I want to remind the audience that if you do want to ask a question, please feel free to raise your hand, and then you can personally address the question to Pierre Jacquet, or alternatively, there is a Q&A box in which you can pose a question. We do have Professor Pradhan, his hand is up. Would you like to pose your question? Professor, you're on mute.
Thank you, Mr. Jacquet. Thank you for such a brilliant lecture, giving an overview. And myself from the ICCE, I also thank you for gracing our inaugural lecture. And I have just one or two small comments to make. And there are two things I can see going to play out quite significantly. And rightly, you have said that one is the role of technology. And I think the country competitiveness, the country, growth would be significantly affected by the way technological progress. I mean, I'm not saying the technology in the traditional sense of the term, the so-called the Internet of Things and Internet-based technology, the metaverse, all of this, the emerging machine learnings, artificial intelligence, and all of them. I think they're quite significantly affecting the way we work, the way we are productive, or the way we engage, or the way the nations engage themselves. So I think that's going to be quite a bit of a deciding factor in growth to a large extent. This is one point I would invite your comments. And on the downside, and I think the climate risk, as you rightly said, the critical areas, is also going to play out in limiting that growth, or if at least the negative side, the climate risk, and it's the carbon emission, the greenhouse emission, gas emission, and all of them. So the countries which leverage on the alternative source of energy, renewables, and trying to reduce their carbon emissions, those who are aiming to achieve the net zero, they inspire their companies to create sustainable business models. And I think this might also help in the long run. So these two things probably will play out to me, appears to be, are significant, among other things, many things that you said. This is my first observations. And the second thing, I think I endorse, agree, and reconfirm your view that the research is, I being a researcher, research is being purely dominated, not just the data, models, theme, and even publications, selections, journals, everything is dominated by the West. And though I can see there are a lot of countries emerging like India, or China, or even Asia, researchers are increasingly getting into, but still I think the theme is dominated. The way we model, or the way we use the data. So our development questions, our questions of social equity or inclusiveness, gender, all of these are also equally important. And I think whether how multilateral level this can be promoted or this can be encouraged, I think you did say some point and you were working on that. I think your thoughts would be very useful for us. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much for these comments. Let me start with the role of technology. Again, going back to what I mentioned about the role of governments, because I think that technological progress and the use of technology are not neutral. They take place in areas in which there are incentives to make discoveries, to find new ways, and so on. So I would suggest, for example, that if there is a substantial carbon tax, that would create a very substantial incentive to find carbon neutral technologies and to use existing technologies in ways that help save carbon. So my point is that we should think of technology not as an exogenous deus ex machina there to solve our problems in the future, but we should see technology, the dynamism of technological change and technological use as a companion for decision makers in engineering a transition. We don't know exactly how that companion will behave, but we know that it will be supportive. We just have to provide the right incentives. And so technological progress depends on the kind of policy actions that can be taken today. It's not something that is going to take place outside exogenously. And I think it's an important point, because people tend to oppose most of the time policy and technology. They will tell you, oh, there are climate optimists that think that technological change will provide the solutions. And there are technology pessimists who think that technology cannot bring anything, and therefore we need strong public action. I think this is not the right debate. The right debate is how to join forces. What kind of system will actually help harness technology as an help to engineer the transition, and it won't happen spontaneously. It has to be helped by the right policy action. So we need to act now, not because we are technology pessimists, but because this is the only way to harness not only technological change, but also the wonderful possibilities offered by the use of existing digital technology, AI, and everything. On the climate risk, I agree with you that acting on climate now is going to limit GDP growth. But if you define growth in another way, for example, if in your indicator of growth you have the decline of carbon emissions, then you can actually increase growth by reducing carbon emissions. So it's all a question of metrics. That's why in the end, what really matters is what counts for me, what matters for me. How much value am I ready to give to the quality of the air that we are breathing, or to climate, and so on. If I give no value, then nothing will happen. And indeed, acting against it will look counterproductive because it will decrease growth. But if in what I call growth of my standard of living, I include this dimension, then I can have a higher standard of living by acting against, even though the old metrics, it's not old right now, but it would be at that time, of GDP would show a decline. And so that's where metrics, I think, does matter a lot. Now, on research domination, well, thanks for your supportive comments. I mean, it's, you know, it comes down to realizing that research is part of the development process, and it's not there to provide solutions. It's there to help people shape their own solution, which is quite different. Unfortunately, a lot of current research donors look at research as a way to provide solutions. And when you do that, you want that research to be conducted, of course, in the best places in the world. So money is not going to go to the places in which you need to build capacity. They will go to places in which excellent, quote unquote, excellent research by the standards is already conducted. So a change of view is needed, and it's not, again, it's not either or. We do need that kind of research conducted in the Western, the biggest Western universities as well. But it's only one aspect of the social utility of research. The other aspect is, as I said, research as development, research as a discipline of thinking about evidence and existing knowledge that will help translate into the debate and into policy formulation. So I hope that change will happen. I see some indications that research donors are increasingly serious about promoting research in developing countries. My organization, GDN, is always looking for funds to do that, and it's not an easy thing. But I see some indication that this message is increasingly audible, which is nice. And by the way, that works, and it's very encouraging to see that research capacity can actually lead to very good results, including in terms of publications.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Very thoughtful. Thank you.
Those are very thoughtful indeed. Thank you, Mr. Jacquet. I personally like the idea potentially of coming up with a almost GDP augmented ESG type of factor, because the way that we are moving, a lot of companies are already giving, airtime to ESG in their annual results or interim results and what they are doing to achieve it. And I think you very much highlight a point that is absent. So as, a researcher, myself, I would like to think about this more broadly, but I think this could be quite an exciting development for economists. We do have a question from the floor, and the hand of Emmanuel Jengo is up. Would you please pose your question? Emmanuel, you might be on mute. Okay, we don't seem to get any response from Emmanuel. Oh, there we go. Emmanuel, please just unmute. There we go. Hi there.
Hello. You getting me?
Yes.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, my name is Emmanuel Jengo from Sierra Leone.
Hi, Emmanuel. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I was on a meeting with Bill Gates recently on climate change at the University of Nairobi here in Kenya. So on the role of technology, he is saying that African to have a generation of scientists, because through science, a lot of innovation can come from health and agriculture. Now, looking at some of these issues, he also said there are the responsibilities of rich countries, whereby rich countries have to pour in resources, whereby to be able to tackle the climate change in the world. And we are seeing like can climate change be mitigated through innovative finance? We have seen certain meetings that have been held in Egypt, this COP 2027. We have seen immensely that there is a significant ground to cover in entrenching green intervention across all facets of socio-economic activities. So we are seeing through this discussion that the main key issue about this climate change is about resource mobilization, because to do research, to use that research, Africa as a research-based center, a lot of resources has to be in, because you see like in Africa, people want to advance in research to be able to help on climatical conditions issues, but because of there is no resources, or maybe they have the technology, but they don't have the very standard technology to be able to address some of these challenges. So you see, even recently, Bill Gates has to donate the sum of $7 billion to Africa on healthcare and all this other climate mitigation, funding the zero emission. So I'm so happy that ICCE is taking such immense action in helping the climate change in Africa or the world at large be achieved. I'm happy to be part of this particular forum. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for this, Emmanuel. A couple of comments on the role of technology and the role of a generation of scientists in Africa. Yes, actually, it's exactly the same point that I was making for social sciences. We need to have a generation of scientists in Africa and elsewhere, by the way, because they will play that mediation role. They will not only produce science by themselves, but they will also play that mediation role between what is known scientifically outside of their countries and the users that can be made for their countries. And this is something that is very, very important. And it's a role of research, which again goes in the direction I was arguing, which is not only to produce science, but also to understand and use science in a given environment. Somehow you need researchers also to help that process. So thanks for making that point. Indeed, it's very, very important. Now, on resources, yes, I don't think that everything is a question of resources, by the way, because once you have the resources, you need also to use them in effective ways. And that again depends on the environment, of course, on governance issues, but also on incentives. But yes, you need resource mobilization. But even on resource mobilization, for it to happen properly, you need the proper incentives. And maybe we are reaching that point slowly when it comes to the West providing enough resources to developing countries. I think we are not there yet, but I think the debate and the symbols are going in the right direction. But one major aspect of resource mobilization is in developing countries themselves. Don't forget that the bulk of resource mobilization is actually within the countries. Development assistance is a small part most of the time. It can be significant in some countries, but it's still small relative to domestic resources. So the question of how to mobilize domestic resources, which actually requires to show effectiveness of public spending as a counterpart, is a major question. How to combat fraud, how to deal with the informal sector, all these questions, which, by the way, were the subject of GDN's annual conference this year, a couple of weeks ago. I think that's very important. So yes, domestic resource mobilization and domestic resource mobilization, not only mobilization of Western resources, matter a lot, but incentives for that mobilization and for using the resources are key to generate any meaningful transition toward a greener and more inclusive economy.
Thanks very much for that. We've got another question really relating to the research entities in third world countries. And what advice would you give these entities to enable them to attract research funding for extensive research within a third world perspective? And this is because the participant believes that such concise data will help improve the global discourse on development.
I'm not sure I can give advice to the research entities themselves, except the advice that I would give is to check their own governance, of course, and to develop their own research agenda. But unfortunately, they face constraints. They need to find resources, and they don't have the hand on that. They have to actually be present in a research funding market that is not functioning very well. So the advice I would give is to governments to develop their own research policies. We have a program at GDN called Doing Research, which looks systematically at research systems in developing countries and analyzes how they work, how research is produced, how it is organized, how it is funded and by whom, outside and inside the country, whether there are contracts given by the government or not, a number of structural dimensions that help explain how a research system functions and interacts with policymaking. And the reason we are doing this program is that we hope that the debate that is generated out of these studies will have an impact on research policies. So we talk very often about policy research, research that is relevant for policymaking, but I think we need to focus also on research policy and research politics in the countries, because that's an important element that will allow local research institutions and entities to develop. There was a major initiative a few years ago that lasted 10 years and was provided with $100 million, so a big one, which was called the TTI, the Think Tank Initiative, funded by many donors, including the Gates Foundation, the Hewlett Foundation, the IDRC in Canada, and others. And the idea was to provide funding, including core funding, for selected think tank in developing countries. And there is an evaluation of that initiative that I would encourage everyone interested in this aspect to look, which show that actually there were some very productive impacts, but comes down to the role of core funding. Without core funding, it's very hard for research entities to retain resources, human resources. And that's something that, of course, impairs their ability to act. And for that, you need long-term resource mobilization as well. And this is where research policies matter a lot. So the advice to research entities is to be well governed and to shape their own research agenda, and to militate for this view of research that is fundamental in any given country.
Thanks, Mr. Jacquet. I think you have really honed in on a topic that is quite relevant today, and especially in the post-pandemic world, is the, I would say, increasing governance issues around how funds get managed, and specifically with regard to the role that public policy plays to put a social safety net under, you know, vulnerable individuals and even firms. If anything, the pandemic has kind of shifted us towards that to some extent. But I want to tie this back into earlier discussions around, you know, thinking differently about growth and the role that good leadership plays with regard to, you know, a better or more optimal growth structure. But I also want to bring into the question, or rather bring in the question around whether you think publicly or structurally rather, has government's actions to promote support for redistributive policies that came as a result of the pandemic, a pandemic response, has there been a structural change that the pandemic has given towards the role of public policy? I'm fearing that you say, and you have mentioned earlier, that we only have a very short-term memory, and so whatever the pandemic response was might be fleeting. I would just like your comments in whether you think that public policy has perhaps undergone a structural shift since the pandemic.
I guess the short answer would be to say I don't know, but it would not be very satisfactory, right? So let me try to be a bit longer on that. I think that the realization that, first of all, I'm going to talk here from the developed country perspective, that is from the perspective of countries in which there are already quite developed social policies. And of course, the debate is different in developing countries where the urge is to develop social policies. In the high-income countries, there are social policies. And I think the realization that these current social policies were not adapted to the challenge of the time predates COVID. So COVID-19 increased the urgency to look at the most affected segments of the population. But beyond that, there is a structural